So welcome everyone to the Ocean Day panel series. Today, our series of panel conversations covering a wide range of ocean topics. We'll kick off with our first panel, California Kelp Crisis, Working to Save the Sequoias of our Sea. In this conversation, we'll be discussing the critical issue of kelp forest conservation and restoration. And we are joined today by four outstanding individuals who have dedicated their careers to studying and protecting our oceans. Our moderator for today's panel is David Helvarg, the executive director of Blue Frontier and author of the acclaimed book, The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea. David has spent over 40 years working as a journalist, author, and environmental activist, and has been recognized as a leading voice in the fight to protect our oceans. So go ahead and pass it off over to our moderator, David, to introduce the rest of the panelists and kick us off.
Thank you, Ben. And as I say, I'm excited today to have this panel where we'll be talking with Natasha Benjamin. Natasha is a filmmaker, a marine scientist, and I'm proud to say Blue Frontier's associate director, now working on Sequoias of the Sea, a documentary about the kelp crisis. We also have Tristan McHugh, who's an ecologist and the Kelp project director for the Nature Conservancy. Tristan's based in Mendocino, California. And just up the road is Grant Downey, who's a second-generation commercial sea urchin fisherman based in Fort Bragg, and is now also active on kelp restoration, working with Tristan and many others. I thought maybe I'd just start with last year I wrote about the crisis for the New York Times. They titled it, "Another California Forest is in Peril, but this one is underwater." And I wrote the bull kelp forest of Northern California are sometimes spoken of as the redwoods of the sea. And like the redwoods, these forests are in danger. In less than a decade, these otherworldly undersea landscapes, lush with life, have all but disappeared along 200 miles of coast north of San Francisco's Golden Gate. The warming climate has set in motion this disaster, and it's unclear whether it can be reversed as greenhouse gas emissions continue to flood the atmosphere. Energy-related carbon dioxide emissions rose by 6% globally in 2021, the biggest increase ever, as the world began bouncing back from pandemic. These kelp forests are yet another ocean casualty of fossil fuel climate disruption, along with habitats ruined by coral bleaching, rising sea levels, warming ocean waters, and the pronounced loss of Arctic sea ice. And then I go on to describe diving in kelp forest, which is, the experience. And then say from its floating canopies to its holdfast roots, kelp supports ocean biodiversity and sequesters more carbon than redwood groves, while also protecting the coastline from the full force of storms. California's thousands of acres of giant and bull kelp forest shelter finfish, shellfish, seals, and sharks, more than 1,000 animal and plant species in all, making it one of the most productive ecosystems on Earth. And true until about a decade ago. So what happened in 2013, 2014, Tristan? What's the science of kelp today?
Hey, can you all hear me okay?
We hear you fine.
Okay, great. I may have some connection issues, but I'm working on it on my end. But thank you for that introduction. So there's a lot to unpack there with what you just said. There's a lot of things that happened to the north coast of California, frankly, that led us to where we are today. I think first notably, we want to kind of jump into the most recent events that hit, but it is important to kind of acknowledge that ecological and social predicament that did lead us here. First and foremost, predators, right? When we think about redundancy in an ecosystem, biodiversity, the health of an ecosystem is really foundationally rooted in having all those key characters in it. And so in the north coast of California and other regions, frankly, in the Eastern Pacific, the loss of sea otters to the fur trade happened, around 1800s, 1850s is when we think that they were finally wiped out of this area. And so just putting that little caveat of like one predator out. Then let's fast forward now into 2013, perhaps. We started to see these abnormally warm waters paired, and this is where it gets kind of confusing, right? Because they're all happening around the same time, but we don't know the sequence quite yet. But what we do know is we saw around the same time marine heat wave, El Nino event, loss of sea stars, frankly, like over 90% of sea star species, were affected, impacted by a mysterious disease in the system. And so most notably, the sunflower star was taken out of the system. And so for us in Northern California, that was critically important because we don't have any other predators like lobster or sheep's head or these other creatures. So that was like a really big moment for us. Then with those heat wave events, that's not great for kelp growth. The kelp did not do so well. Urchin, subsequently, native purple urchin, changed their behavior into becoming active feeders. They started looking for food. And then that's where we are now, right? These urchin have moved into the nearshore ecosystem, displacing red urchin, displacing abalone, and creating a urchin barren, as we call it. And now it's transitioned from one phase state of a kelp forest into an urchin barren, functionally kind of rooted in low biodiversity, purple urchin kind of carpeting the seafloor, not really able to support kelp growth. So that's the current predicament we're in, and some of the reasons or maybe causes that led us to this point.
Good. So there was this, what we call the blob, the marine heat wave that came in. The sea stars got the sea star wasting disease, but there was science later showed that warming water supercharged what would be a normal disease into a coast-wide loss of sea stars, your last predator. And now we're in this new situation, which impacts not just this ecosystem, but the people who depend on it. So Grant, maybe you could walk us through, you're out there, you're commercial urchin fishing with your dad, you're out on hookah, and what's the last decade looked like in terms of your livelihood and community?
Yeah, thank you, David. So since 1980s, sea urchin divers have been that other predator of the sea urchin. Predominantly, we focus on the larger red sea urchin, but historically, there always has been a commercial harvest for the native purple species as well. I started diving in 2008. Right when I got into the industry, it was booming. We were getting a lot of pounds of urchins up here on the North Coast. The kelp was really healthy, and the native purple urchins were really corralled into their little shallow purple beds. They weren't spread out like they are now. There were probably about 50 or more active divers up here on the North Coast, and we were all making a living, and everything was going smoothly. We started seeing a decline in kelp around 2013, 2014. A lot of the divers realized something was happening. And by 2017, the attrition of divers started falling off because there just wasn't enough kelp to sustain a healthy abundance of red urchins. Right around the same time, we started noticing that there was this new juvenile, smaller purple urchin that was spread out everywhere. So historically, the purple urchins were really large sized and were in your shallower intertidal areas. Now that there wasn't as much food in the system and we had this big warm water event, the purple urchin went on a population boom, and we were seeing small quarter-sized purple urchins everywhere, up and down the coastline. My range of diving is about 20 miles north and 20 miles south of Fort Bragg. And we were seeing purples everywhere, all the way out to 70 feet of water. Around 2018 is when we had our first real kelp restoration project push to start removing some of these purple urchins to restore the reefs back to their just normal rocky habitat that could sustain kelp. And that's when I started jumping into restoration. And I really enjoy the work. I'm working to bring back the kelp, but also I'm working to bring back the industry that has me living here on the Northern California coast and raising a family and growing up where I did. My father was a sea urchin diver, and that's the way I was able to be raised in our beautiful little community here.
So the more you guys talk, the more questions I have, but let's move on to Natasha. I've known a while and I knew your dad as a filmmaker. You're now working with Ana Blanco, who's the director of the International Ocean Film Festival that just ended, on a documentary called Sequoias of the Sea about what's going on with this kelp crisis. So what's your background that brought you to that particular work and your work with also Tristan and Grant on this movie?
Yeah, it's great to be here and be with Tristan and Grant talking more about all of these issues. The way, this kind of started a long time ago for me, but basically I've been, diving and looking at what's been happening on the North Coast. And as a diver and a surfer on the North Coast of California, I watched the kelp forest disappear before my very own eyes, just like Grant and Tristan and many others. And about a year and a half ago, I started talking to Ana Blanco, the director of the International Ocean Film Festival here in San Francisco. And I asked her, has there been a film telling this story at the film festival? This is our backyard where this is happening, this 95% loss that most people really don't know about. I mean, most people don't even know what kelp is, let alone that we've lost the majority of it. And Anna said there hadn't been a film, and her and I started working together, went up to Fort Bragg and met with Tristan and Grant and many others that are working on this issue and trying to tell this story, trying to elevate what is happening locally in Mendocino, what is happening on the restoration and the science, and really the impact that this kelp loss has had on the community, had on the fishermen, had on the tribes, and really the whole community that depends on this ecosystem. So as a scientist and a filmmaker, this was started really as a passion project and now is becoming bigger. We need to tell this story, not just to, here in California, but nationally and even internationally. This is a climate change story that's happening all over the world in different shapes and forms. But this is kind of my local backyard story that I really want to tell. And the epicenter is really happening in Fort Bragg, where Tristan and Grant are. And that's where we're focusing the story right now.
And of course, a lot with the ocean, it's out of sight, out of mind. I mean, it's 71% of our planet. People don't think about it. The last 2 or 3 years, I've been covering California's wildfires for National Geographic and others as a crisis that everybody recognizes, that the wildfires out of control, and very few people recognize this other forest crisis as it was emerging. I guess talk about the process. I'm sure it was initially frustrating, but just communicating how real the crisis was in terms of the effort to get some resources to address this as the kelp disappeared in a relatively short time and you began to see this emergence of these urchin barrens. What were your first senses of how extreme it was and how you communicated that to the state and others whose resources you needed to start working on restoration?
Yeah, Tristan, you wanna?
Grant, you're welcome to hit that off first, or I can, whatever works for me.
I'll start it out by saying, as a commercial urchin industry, we really saw it happening. We're out there on the water, we're diving, we're underwater, we're seeing it happen. And I really like how it should be compared to a wildfire, especially in these pterogophora beds and even the bull kelp beds, because you go into an area where it used to just be a lush kelp forest, understory algae and everything. And all that's left is stalks and stipes and roots. And the purple urchins are the wildfire that really wiped out the reefs and just left everything as just scorched bare rock. But to answer your question, a small amount of divers in our commercial industry, we aren't as big in the public's eyes as other things. And I think the big eye opener was the choice for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to close the recreational abalone industry. When they shut down recreational abalone, which was a $20 to $40 million annual revenue for the state, all these people of the public of all different walks of lives and all different communities, they lost something that they'd been doing forever, for history. And that is really what opened everybody's eyes.
So it was the recreational ab diving. Suddenly there were people in Southern California and Central California who were aware that something was going on up in your neighborhood.
Yeah, they weren't able to take their vacations and come over and get their limits of abs, and it's because there's just not enough food to sustain everything.
And what about you, Tristan? How did the scientific community sort of wake up and start moving from observation to participation?
I would say if I had to put a year on it, like 2018 is like a big one in my mind of when things started going from maybe more passive acknowledgement of what was happening up north into more active. I love that question because the genesis of how we got here, I think, is really fascinating. And I don't even know if we can look back and say, like, this is what happened, because we're still living those moments in real time, you know? So it's kind of hard to reflect. But maybe to your question about how science jumped in. So off the back of what Grant said, I'll speak from personal opinion. I moved up to the North Coast to start research diving. I was coordinating volunteer divers. I used to work for Reef Check, which is a phenomenal nonprofit that trains community or citizen scientists into becoming active divers. So I spent a lot of time around then in the water. And one of the, in addition to, I think, the recreational, maybe like fishing community and commercial, there's also just the people who love just going out and seeing and observing and documenting. So from that lens, there was the same concern. Like, there were folks like, something's different. This is abnormally different than anything I've ever seen before. And you hear it, but then when it comes down to it, it's like, but how, right? And communicating that at the time, we're like, I think there needs to be a little science lens here. There needs to be something to allow us to get in and help start addressing some of the questions, because I think a big thing at the time, coming off 2018 or so, is like, helping or hurting, should we get involved? If so, to what level? And all those questions, I think, kind of came down to, could we design some kind of program or anything to help start unpacking some of those questions that we have. And so that's what led us into like our current restoration projects that we have, but they were and still are very foundationally rooted into learning. Like, we still don't know the impacts of our efforts in that space. And I think it's important to keep checking in with that we're not necessarily advocating for one thing or another just quite yet. It's more, we're very much learning how to engage in potential restoration or protection of these valued ecosystems.
Okay, and before we get into different restoration strategies, I want to stay a little more on the history. And Natasha, I assume that Sequoias of the Sea will have some of that historical perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's actually one of the most interesting pieces as I've been diving into the kelp issue, is looking at kind of the natural history of bull kelp specifically, and that region, and just the whole kelp highway from Mexico to Alaska, and how important that entire ecosystem was, to all of the communities along that whole stretch of the West Coast. And as Tristan is saying, like, this is happening in real time right now. And in terms of telling the story, I don't think we don't really know what the end of the story is going to be. We did see a slight uptick a couple years, 2 summers ago, but the kelp is not doing very well right now. And the time is now to really get this story out there and let people know what's going on in Northern California, which is really different than what's happening in other parts of the world. So I think, it's really critical to look at not just the natural history, but also what's happened to the communities. And that's really what what I want to focus on in the film.
And I think, again, people in California, nationally, globally, it's taken a while, but they understand that coral reefs are in trouble. But I think kelp is the new coral, because kelp is, cold water habitat that's, incredibly diverse as our coral reefs. It's different habitat and different species that it supports, and it's in trouble globally. But ground zero is definitely Fort Bragg, California. I think the other interesting aspect is in covering California's wildfires. There's definitely a strong climate element that talk to any Cal Fire firefighter and they'll tell you it's grown. But there's also 100 years of bad forest management. There's also a lack of planning and the urban wildland interface. This is much more a pure climate crisis, it seems, in that, going back to Captain Cook, we took out the sea otters and other predators, but really California is very good at coastal and ocean management and protection. And what happened was largely a result of warming oceans and warm water from climate change. So it's tough. You do local, go on.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, that California is one of the most protected and well-managed coastlines in the world. We have a network of marine protected areas. We have very strict fisheries management in place. And yet this happened here on our coastline. And that's one of the pieces that I'm really interested in understanding is, this happened here, and what are going to be the ramifications? I mean, we saw the abalone fishery shut down. We've seen, impacts in different areas, but what are going to be the long-term consequences of losing most of the habitat that's key to not just abalone, but the rockfish populations, other invertebrates, really that entire ecosystem. And we don't know really the impacts yet. And because those rockfish populations are long-lived, I think it's going to take at least another 10 years really to see that impact. So this is unfortunately just the beginning of a cascading of kind of events that are coming.
Right. And this is also the 10th anniversary of my book, The Golden Shore, California's Love Affair with the Sea. And when it came out, the San Francisco Chronicle said, this might even make you might even make you hopeful for the future. Well, the future's here now, and I'm less hopeful, but I still think California can lead in coastal ocean climate resiliency and adaptation. And in terms of the kelp disaster, what does restoration and adaptation mean, Tristan? What are we doing to begin to collaborate and strategize and plan for restoration?
It's a great question. I think I had raised my hand really briefly off the back of something you had said that I think maybe leads into this question too. But I think a big one we're experiencing right now is maybe not necessarily that kelp is the new coral, but maybe more so that there are multiple ecosystems experiencing this unprecedented loss at the same time, right? So, I've heard fires a few times. Just in the time that kelp started declining, so let's say 2014, in 5 years, we lost 96% of canopy forming kelp species in a 350 kilometer stretch of coastline, right? At that same time, look at Tahoe, look at anywhere else you can think about in California that's experienced a fire. Like, we've had catastrophic carbon sequestration loss in California. So if you just look at California in that space and not even consider Australia's experiencing the same thing, mangroves all over the world, corals all over the world, like, we're in this moment, we're all very aware of it, but we're in this like catastrophic loss. So I think actually a big thing that a lot of us are starting to talk about is how we can leverage multiple ecosystem restoration under the same umbrella, right? So thinking, it's not just putting our blinders on and thinking about the terrestrial forest or the kelp. It's like, can we think about oyster, seagrass, and kelp together? Can we think about that intertidal environment? Can we think about that estuarine environment? And really having them all sing together as they are intended to do and as they actually behave. So I think it's really more about the human's ability to understand or begin to understand the connectivity across these ecosystems in the landscape of this current day or current age of how we aim to protect and restore, right? So it's really more so about, I think, our cultural appreciation for these spaces and just drawing on these linkages that have been known to exist for many centuries.
And Grant, did you, not just you, the commercial fishermen, others, I mean, when did you make the link between, you know, suddenly there's this collapse of your livelihood and the climate part of it?
I think it was the harvest shift. It really was. Typically, we would harvest in these healthy areas of kelp forests and understory algae. And with that loss and not having the healthy sea urchins that our industry depends on, we shifted and we moved to a deeper shelf and to a deeper line, picking urchins that typically we wouldn't spend our time doing just because of the dangers and because of the harvest rates. But that was all that was left for us as an industry to survive with. I also want to put in there that the North Coast commercial sea urchin industry was a federally declared disaster for 2016 and 17 because harvest rates, just like kelp, were 90% loss. And that's revenue and poundage wise. And now moving in, we have a disaster on the table for 2018 and 19 as well that hopefully we will be declared for. And what's really sad is that our harvest rates are still at an extreme all-time low on the North Coast, but because they've been so low for so long now, that's just our average. And until we can bring back the kelp and we can bring back our industry, this is what we're left with here.
So what depth were you in a healthy phase picking urchin, and what depth did you go to before it just was pointless?
So typically we would harvest in like 60 to 20 feet, 60 to 25 feet. That was really the sweet spot. That's where the kelp forests really like to grow. I mean, we'd see bull kelp grow out to 70 feet deep and deeper than that. But the whole industry shifted to about a 70 to 120 foot range. The urchins were eating a different type of a growth that had also come with this warm water event on the deep reefs, where, it hasn't been studied scientifically. It was either a small barnacle growth or it was a worm growth that would cover the reefs like fuzz, and the deep urchins really just mowed it over. And that's where we focused a lot of our time. Unfortunately, up here on the North Coast, we don't have a long shelf that goes out like Southern California. It's really a pretty steep drop off. So we don't have that much of that depth zone to focus on. And then deeper depths come with dangers. In the past 6 years that we've all been focusing on that deeper depth, we've had about 3 divers get bent, and we also lost a diver to the bends. So
I was just going to ask that. So
the danger wasn't worth it. And that stems us into restoration work. Fishermen working alongside with scientists, it hasn't always been a thing. A lot of the old timer divers and fishermen, they're afraid to really branch out and work with environmental agencies and stuff like that. They don't want the data to come back and harm the fishery. But seeing what we had lost and what we could bring back by moving into restoration, that's what really enticed a lot of the divers to do so.
So, and yeah, Tristan's not only a scientist, but she's with the Nature Conservancy. So fishermen, scientists, environmentalists, NOAA, these are not historically compatible groups, but I guess crisis creates new alliances. Maybe talk about how that collaboration came into being, some of the funding that came from the state, and like Jared Huffman got some federal funds. How did this get up and rolling?
So initially, the first project that I had mentioned in 2018 was actually spearheaded by a recreational abalone group, the Watermen's Alliance. Josh Russo, director of the Watermen's Alliance, and everybody that was a part of that group was able to come up and fundraise up to $25,000. And then the state, the CDFW, actually matched that amount to kick off a pilot removal project. Right off the bat, there really wasn't a lot of science involvement in that. There was a little bit of dockside sampling that was done from our local NOYO center, but it wasn't as researched as the projects that followed after that. So going into 2019, before the pandemic, all these stakeholders sat down at the table and we all shared pizza and we all talked about what we had learned in 2018. And we really brainstormed what needed to happen to kick off this next big project. And that's where this whole Ocean Protection Council money and Reef Check project came out of, was this collaborative group of stakeholders, a couple urchin divers, a couple scientists, Josh Russo, a sport diver, and then a representative from CDFW and Ocean Protection. And we were all able to sit there and share pizza and work together. And we came up with this plan that lasted 2 years and established clearings at 2 sites up here on the North Coast. It was great. It got a lot of people back in the water that hadn't dove in a few years. And what was really exciting is the site at North Noyo, where we focused a lot of the time, we had kelp grow back in the site. We had created a clearing and we had gotten full kelp canopy back where we restored. I think that's the goal, is bringing back kelp. That is the all-time goal.
Great. So CDFW is the California Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Yeah.
Tristan, when did you and the Nature Conservancy jump on board with this? And
Yeah.
what's your role?
Yeah, that's a great question. I've been involved since origins for this project, but my role has shifted in that time, from Reef Check to the Nature Conservancy. But and some of what I do in those projects has changed. But yeah, I've been involved like since inception. And I think an important thing to flag too is when we're talking about like the North Coast restoration work, it's super dynamic. So the example like Grant's giving is like, that's like one piece. There's also like the recreational community component too, that kind of, Grant, correct me if I'm wrong, but like they're kind of interplayed, right? Where the recreational community was like in the water. We had mentioned Josh Russo, like there was a lot of public momentum that like got us into this moment. And part of where the needs were like folks to get in the water and start capturing the data to help support those efforts and help start unpacking like what was the role of human in that. So where I kind of really shifted our time and like where we spend it now is really helping leverage our lessons learned from what we've been doing and try to move us into like the next phases of that questioning, right? So everything we're talking about is urchin removal, right? So that's like resetting, clearing off the urchin so that we can create space for kelp. Something Grant mentioned, which was amazing, is that when we did that at one of our sites, we did see kelp come back. But one thing that we also found out was it's pretty delicate. It was super delicate. Like, we stepped away from the site for just a few months and urchin, like at that particular location, just moved back in, and we saw that multiple times. So we've been trying to
I'm sorry to interrupt, but where was that location and how big was that restoration, that kelp coming back? Was it an acre, 4 acres?
Oh yeah, so it's a 10-acre site, and the whole point of it was to really leverage like an extant like kelp patch that had survived at Noyo, that was like really close to beach, freshwater influence, all those fun characteristics that we're still unpacking why. But the idea was to move that into the urchin barren system. So, and that's pretty characteristically the way that others all over the world have approached restoration too. So it wasn't like this was necessarily a novel concept. We were pulling in from other places that had started confronting kelp loss as well. So I think for this particular project though, like and others just starting out with this, like the baseline is like, if you have an urchin problem, you have to address the urchin problem before you can do the other things. So the first couple of years of all of our work in the North Coast have been centered around, for this project, like, could commercial urchin divers remove urchin systematically? And if so, does kelp come? Like, that was like the focal point of our questioning. And I would say that same line of questioning applies to the recreational community. Like, can they organize to remove urchin? And if so, does kelp come? And understanding what it took to do that. So segue into like where we're at now is, we do know commercial divers can do this. They're very good at it. We also know urchin are very good at coming back in certain places. So how can we get a little quicker about methods to either reduce urchin or selecting sites that have a better chance of success? And that's in one part what we're doing. And then the back end is, it's not just about urchin removal, it's also about enhancing kelp. So now we're exploring what kind of kelp enhancement strategies can we do to facilitate or maybe more so catalyze that recovery of the forest at a scale that we intend to, at a scale and pace to which we want to kind of see the ecosystem move in. And we're, again, drawing from other places and folks who have been exploring these up to date.
Great. Now, Natasha, I'm going to go back to you because, we're communicators, and part of it is, what popular analogies can be drawn. So one of the problems we know is that they don't just eat, starve, and die. There's zombie urchins. Why don't you tell me about what a zombie urchin is? Zombies are very popular these days in all form of media.
Yeah, that was one of the headlines. And there's been a lot of kind of villainizing these purple urchins, which we see behind Grant here. We got to remember, these are native species. They were there. They've been here for a long time. And they were, when the ecosystem was in balance, the purple urchins were there and they were happy and we were happy.
They're cute. They're like little purple pincushions.
Puffballs. But now the system is out of balance, and there's hundreds times more purple urchins in the system than there should be. What's unfortunate is that these purple urchins are not really commercially viable at this point. They're what's considered in a zombie state, or almost kind of they're empty. What we do love about urchins and what people eat is the uni. And there is none in these purple urchins. There's another company, and there's a couple people that are looking at trying to bring these purple urchins to market. And that's another kind of, I don't know if we want to call it a solution, but another aspect of what's happening in this kelp world. And I think that's an interesting one. Obviously, that can't happen in isolation, but trying to get people to eat urchins is kind of like that eating for solutions. If we can create a market for these purple urchins, then maybe we can remove them and actually, give them to people. And maybe Grant wants to comment on that. I know Grant has been marketing some of the purple urchins in addition to the red urchins when you can find them. Are people interested in eating purples, and kind of how's that going?
Yeah, so as I mentioned in the beginning, the red sea urchin is normally what is focused on in our commercial industry. There's a couple of reasons for that. It's a larger animal, so therefore it's easier to process and deal with. And then also the red urchin isn't as seasonal with how it can build up its gonads or its uni. The red urchin does go through spawning cycles throughout the year. However, if it can eat, it eats for a month or so, and then it builds up roe for a couple months before it spawns out from a cold water or a wind event. However, the purple sea urchin is very finicky with how it builds up its uni in the wild. It's usually harvested in the fall. Lately on the North Coast, we've actually been finding purple urchins to have commercially viable uni from about August to December. but historically it was a lot less than that. Side by side, dockside sales, I've been reaching out and trying to build a local market up here on the North Coast. There's not a lot of dockside sales and walk-up sales up here as there are in Southern California, Santa Barbara to say, and I think it's just all population driven. But in my sales to the public, the ability to offer a red urchin and a purple urchin side by side, I'd say the majority of the non-urchin eater public prefers the purple urchin over the red urchin. The purple urchin uni is very creamy and sweet comparative to the red urchin that is more of a briny, umami, oystery flavor, in my opinion. So if there is a possibility to offer this product year round, which is what Natasha was going towards with the ranching idea, then I definitely feel there is a market to help eat the problem. The only issue I see as a harvester underwater is the commercially viable size of a purple urchin. So 2 inches or larger is probably only about 20% of the population we have here on the coast. The big issue, or the nuisance urchin, I don't like to call them zombies, but the nuisance purple urchin, it's about the size of a quarter. And even if it did have uni, there is no possible way you could process or crack or get anything out of it to make it worth it. So that's the product that we need to find a solution for. And really, it's a $1 million question. There's all these urchins out there that we want out of the water. We just need to find out what they can be used for. A metric I wanted to throw in there off of what Tristan had said is the outplanting and the boosting of kelp in our environment and in the underwater ecosystem. So if the North Coast has lost 95% of the kelp, and we've seen it bounce back, like in 2021, it bounced back. We had about 10% of our historical kelp beds. You have to think that's only 10% of the historical amount of spores that would be able to be in the ocean. So how can something naturally rebound when the amount of reproductive spores that it's dropping is still at an all-time low? We, not so much myself speaking as I'm on the removal side of it, but scientists and universities that are branching out with kelp outplanting, they need to just flood the system with spores. We need to flood the environment with as much help as we can to get the kelp to rebound.
So up on the Klamath, where they're taking the dams down, the tribes and the fishermen and all, they've collected over 20 billion native plant seeds that they're going to seed the original channel of the river when the dams come out and the reservoir retreats. So I guess you were talking about commercially, we're very good at eating species that we almost pan-fried abalone to extinction. So part of it might be getting a commercial fishery for some of the purple, but you said that's like 20%. There's removal. There's, I guess, the other strategies I'm asking about, outplanting of kelp, maybe growing and outplanting of sea stars. What are the 3 or 4 key strategies people are working on now?
Yeah, I would, the way that my mind kind of thinks is in these different, it's like different buckets of work almost. But, and of course, this is just from my perspective. There's so many other perspectives to consider in this as well. But I think about it this way, right? Mapping and monitoring, right? We want to understand where kelp is, where it's been lost, but also where it's persistent, where is it doing the best. And so one method that we've been trialing is using unoccupied aerial imagery, right? So you're sending out drones and they're piloted by trained folks to go fly over kelp patches and then get down to, it's an incredible 3-centimeter resolution of kelp canopy persistence over time. And we can look at those and help us understand, like, where is kelp doing well? And how does it change over time? All of those like things that you would kind of want to know before you got in. The second is resetting the ecosystem. So what can we do to reduce the number of urchin in the system? create space. And what we're looking at right now in the North Coast, at least, is, as mentioned, commercial hand harvest. So commercial divers hand harvesting, bringing them back. There's also an emergency regulation that Fish and Game Commission opened that's active until April 2024 for both Casper Cove and Tankers Reef in Monterey, where the public can get in the water and participate in urchin culling experiment. So that's like, you know, 2 forms of in-water people doing some level of urchin removal. And then something that Grant and I are working on alongside the department is trapping. So trying to reduce the population of urchin without sending a diver in. So we're looking at urchin trapping, and we've been working on that project for the last 3 years. Yeah, this will be our 3rd season testing it out. So that's another component of resetting the ecosystem. And then the last one is kelp enhancement, right? So trying to figure out, like, what is that best practice for boosting kelp in the North Coast? Is it green gravel? We found that didn't like hold as well as we would hope it did. So now we're looking at inoculating other substrates like lime, and these other to like lift it off the bottom, you know. So there's like a lot of like, there's a lot happening right now to help figure out what are the right tools. And that goes straight in conjunction with the kelp restoration management plan that the state of California is leading and putting together. So a lot of the work, actually, you know, a majority of the work that's on the ground right now is just trying to understand, like, what do we possibly have at our disposal to better understand kelp dynamics over time, but then also help us address the issue. So I just want to flag, like, it is an ongoing conversation around like what tools, because again, like, we are just one community that is experiencing this. There's anywhere kelp is in the world in temperate systems, like, they are also troubleshooting this. And that's another area where I spend a lot of time, is with an eye towards that global landscape as well.
And
So
I
when
just
we
wanna say-
reintroduced wolves to Yellowstone, it helped restore and create a more dynamic ecosystem. So, Grant, I understand you got a photograph of the first predator to return to the to your neck of the woods, one of the big sea stars.
Yes.
Plans to reintroduce those predators.
Yes. So when I started diving, up until the disaster, I remember seeing the Pycnopodia, the sunflower star, everywhere. It was a natural predator that we need here on the coast. I think it was December 6th of last year, right towards the end of the year. I found a large, healthy sunflower star on a dive when I had been commercially harvesting urchins. And it was amazing to see. I was in disbelief. The amount that have been spotted up and down the coast since 2016 is just super dismal. I think it's about 6 that have been found. So to find this healthy, large animal, it really gave me hope. And then what's really exciting is about 2 weeks ago, I found another one up here on the North Coast, a smaller juvenile sunflower star, which makes me think that maybe there are more out there that aren't being found, and they're able to naturally reproduce on their own, and hopefully they can come back. That's a predator that we've had here on the coast that was doing its job. You know, there was just a study done up north that the sunflower star will target this empty, barren purple urchin, and that's something that the other predator, the otter, isn't interested in. So that's majority of all the urchins we have up here are empty, non-viable product. So something that'll take care of that rather than a diver is what we need. So reintroduction of the sunflower star, I strongly support.
Natasha, I think I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
I lost that train of thought, but just on the sunflower star, I think, you know, this is a great sign of hope, and really the first sign that we've seen. And the fact that Grant found 2 out of 6 apparently is even more exciting, you know, in that stretch where we need them more than ever. There are efforts to to grow and reintroduce these sunflower sea stars that are happening in laboratories up in Washington and in Monterey, but that's going to take a really long time. So seeing them in the natural habitat is a great sign, and we really need those predators. I just want to go back to what Kristen was saying in terms of there's so many efforts right now on restoration, and there's so many different partners and universities and scientists and groups that are working on this. Nature Conservancy and Reef Check and many others. And I think one of the things that's been hard is bringing people together to talk about all these different efforts, and that's something that I think on the state level is happening more and more. But I think
Natasha, you were going to mention, or you were going to film actually, Reef Check, I guess, is working in Sonoma.
Reef Check is working along the whole coast, and working with volunteer citizen divers, and also working with some of the tribes as well. And that's something that we're interested in telling that piece of the story. But this really takes like a whole village, as we all know. And there's so many different people working on this issue. And maybe we can post some more resources for folks to find out about some of these other efforts as well.
So I think it's exciting. So many people are engaging. It's as you were saying, I guess one of the Pomo bands are going to be trained for diving and drone observation by Reef Check. A lot of resources, insufficient resources, but you consider the rest of this century is going to be major human projects, going to be ecosystem restoration, and this may be the first wave. Last fall, we went to do a media training at a meeting of 600 coral restoration activists from around the world, and day 2 of the meeting was canceled because of Hurricane Ian. So we're trying to restore ecosystems even as we're in the middle of the climate emergency that's straining them. And so we're balancing what we learn with the disaster we're living in. And I appreciate the communications and the science and the lived experience that you all represent. I don't know, Ben, if you want to start getting questions from folks listening, that might be helpful.
Yeah, there looks like there are some questions that have popped into the Q&A feature. So David, if it's easier for you to sort of go through and facilitate what panelists you want to have answer them, but you should be able to see them in the Q&A feature there, and you can pitch it. But also I'm happy to facilitate as well.
I'm only seeing one here, so.
Let's see, so it looks like there's a few here. Looks like Joe Ruiz with Diving with CJ asked if there is work in creating strains of bull kelp that can withstand warmer degrees, such as giant brown kelp. Perhaps the strains may be created to withstand these temperatures may result favorably.
So the question is, can we
Yes.
grow kelp that's going to adapt to the mess we've made? Tristan, you want to?
Yeah, very quickly. Yes. And I think before even exploring it under that sort of lens, if you take a step back and then think about what we were talking about with 96% loss of kelp, what was left was 4%. So when we talk about a lot of the kelp enhancement that we're doing, or taking strains to do inoculation of substrate, all those things, typically we're using some of that 4%, right? So I think naturally, and we have no other choice, we go and harvest the survivors, right? Those survivors that made it through those heat waves, we're able to kind of use that material, that source material. And so I think not haphazardly, but by necessity, those are the organisms that we are using. And that has been, that this isn't the only ecosystem that is kind of following that trait. It's corals have done it. Trees have, you're just sourcing from what is left.
And what is left is the more resilient generally.
Theoretically, right? It survived, or some level of like seed banking potential that we don't necessarily understand quite yet.
once.
Yeah, but I think to that point, the question around like biosecurity and like which individuals should be propagated if we are to do kelp enhancement. What we do also know is there is relatively low genetic diversity across populations in the North Coast. And so at this time, any kelp enhancement that we do, especially at one of our locations, all the source material is harvested from the site to which we're doing kelp enhancement. So from that extent bed, we're pulling source tissue from there. So it's not like we're pulling from elsewhere, just in case for now.
And Grant, this is the worst of a series of kind of resource disasters that Fort Bragg's faced over time. I don't think when people think of coastal California, they're mostly thinking of like Malibu Barbie's beach house. They're not thinking of Fort Bragg, but you had, in this century alone, you've had the shutdown of the Georgia Pacific mill, the loss of salmon. There's no salmon season this year. Now with the kelp disaster, kind of hard to make a natural resources living anymore on the North Coast.
Yeah, it has been hard. I grew up here. I was born and raised, and I remember hearing the mill horn blow every day at lunch, and that was a huge industry to be lost. There is some logging that has been picking up the last few years, super regulated, and there isn't any local mills anymore. As you mentioned, the salmon season, the last salmon closure was in 2008, and this year it's hitting people really hard because we had such a poor crab season as well. So the town economics is really driven by tourism now, especially post-pandemic, because we are that safe little quaint Northern California town where you can come and enjoy everything and be safe. But that's not why this town's here. This town is here because of fishing and logging. So to keep us at our roots, at our local roots, is something that we need to keep going.
We got another question, Ben.
Yep, so we have another question that came in. So I'll sort of tie it together. One is more of a suggestion or idea, again from Joe, in regard to those quarter-sized purple urchins. So perhaps looking at the harvest as an additive in home fertilizer usage. And there's a question about whether that would be a marketable aspect to it. And then another question sort of also tied to the marketing is if the market is mainly for export. So David McGuire mentioned that he had dove commercially for purple urchins while an undergraduate in the 90s in Santa Barbara, and the market was basically entirely near Japan. And they were called red gold, and they were super abundant, but abalone were already in decline even then. Sort of going through the dynamics of whether or not this market is mainly for something within local communities or also for export as well.
Grant, do you want to take that one?
Well, yeah, I can say to David's comment, when I started diving in 2008, there was a large export market to overseas, and now with the state of uni demand domestically in the United States and the harvest numbers up and down the coast, we aren't even meeting our own demand, and we're importing sea urchins from Mexico, Chile, Argentina, and all over to meet our local demand. So there isn't really an export market anymore. In the feed aspect, it's competition. There's already oyster shell that dominates that calcium market for poultry feed and for agriculture calcium, and the cost for that is really low. So to put a diver in the water to harvest all these urchins, that would raise up the price of something that's already available on the market.
Okay. I see there's a Southern California urchin diver who wants to speak very briefly to what's going on in his area. You want to let him say something
Yep.
briefly, Ben?
I'm going to set him up. So Jeff, you should be able to speak now.
Awesome. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. Yeah. Hey, everybody. It's been a great conversation. And it's really cool to be able to hear you guys put this together and hear about your film, Natasha. I did want to touch base and just inform you guys who I am. I'm a longtime Southern California urchin diver, probably 30 odd years. I've taken a couple breaks and worked for the DoD in between. I still work for them part-time, but I wanted to illuminate the situation here in Southern California, particularly at the Northern Channel Islands. San Miguel Island has probably lost 99% of its algal and kelp forest biomass. And we have the same situation down here. It's really hasn't seen daylight as Northern California has. But that being said, it's caused the resident pinniped population to spread out in search of food to the other Channel Islands, the more southerly ones. It's the nearshore ecosystems collapsed. And just to bring up a couple quick points with regard to that, it is a national park, the Channel Islands, and it is a sanctuary. So, and I've been addressing this for the past 5-6 years and asking for some daylight to be brought in and some collaboration. We probably have, several dozen urchin boats who would be happy to collaborate in restoration projects down here and work on this. And I've communicated with Fish and Game extensively over in the past, and some of the best discussions involved maintaining distinct biological units of kelp, where the urchin divers and or sported commercial can go into areas and do removals in geographically distinct areas that are defendable. That way we have these small kelp forest ecosystems that can rebound when climatic and oceanic conditions are conducive to that. So, and it seemed to make a lot of sense to me. So with that discussion with James Ray, who's now left that division of the department, in my surveys around San Miguel Island and limited harvest because the urchins aren't any good there. So I've identified these areas that are topographically or geographically conducive to removal of the purple urchins, translocation of the red sea urchins, and defending by divers. And I think that may be a way to go to consider in what you guys are doing up there constructively, to have these areas where you can have small scale, robust kelp forest ecosystems that can regenerate when and if the conditions do allow for that. That's one of my goals and objectives in working with USC and UC Irvine and San Diego State to try to develop this and get momentum and hopefully funding. We've applied for some grants for 4, haven't got it funded yet. Have professors at USC that are interested in collaborating. So I don't know how much time you want to give me, but
okay, that's great, Jeff.
Okay.
Why don't I get Tristan and Grant to respond in terms of creating these kind of kelp refugios or kelp stands?
Yes. So Jeff, thank you so much. And it's so nice to hear from you again. So, the kelp crisis, right? Like when we think about the refugia, the stands, like kind of the example I was giving earlier about mapping, monitoring, reset, reforest, right? I think about like if you were to go purchase a home or something, or just anything, right? You're going to do the homework on like what it is to kind of flip, maybe it's a reset house, right? You want to go flip it. You kind of want to know what you're dealing with before you get in there. And some houses are going to cost more to renovate than others based on the condition that they're in. So, I think with kelp and just ecosystem restoration, your biggest chance of return of investment is if you choose sites that have those characteristics or qualities that are very likely to support that transition from urchin barren to kelp forest and hold. So to Jeff's point, maybe to date, a lot of the site selection that we have been kind of going down and why this mapping monitoring component is so huge is we want to know where are those places where kelp refugia exist. And that is really kind of like right now our focal point of understanding what is potentially possible for us to reforest. One point that Jeff brought up too is, the North Coast has taken over like a lot of the conversation. And one thing also to consider is how low population density we have in the North Coast and very little representation relative to the size of the area that we're dealing with. But I'm also not trying to distract from Jeff's point, which is, and the point I made earlier, which is there are multiple places with problems that we need to address all of them accordingly, right? So it's a question of finite resources at this time. So I think a key to this is really unlocking this larger story that's happening statewide, that it's not just the North Coast, it's not just Central, it's not just South, and it's not just California, it's also Oregon and Washington and right? It's like unlocking this grander story around like what is actually happening in these spaces. Another just very brief point too is we're uniquely challenged in the North Coast with our annual species of kelp. So when we talk about our ability to do restoration, I just want to, we didn't talk about this earlier, but a real big challenge for us is being able to do restoration under that context of timing. If you miss one window, you might be a little out of luck. Whereas just south of us with macrocystis or giant kelp, those challenges may not exist as pronounced as they do for us, paired with limited weather windows, paired with a dive shop being 2.5 hours away, those sorts of pieces. So that was kind of a longer winded explanation, but I don't want to discount Jeff's point, which is like there are multiple regions in California that are experiencing different levels of loss that need to be addressed in one way or another.
And Natasha, maybe you can, this is also about shifting baselines because there's 95% loss in parts of Northern California. People are saying, well, you know, the giant kelps come back and so we're coming back in Central and Southern California, which isn't really the story. You know, people can go dive in Monterey, but they're not seeing what they were seeing 10 years ago. And as you've been looking at the larger picture and also planning a social action campaign along with the film, maybe you can talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think as Tristan said, and we all know this is very nuanced, and each region has these different issues. There's different predators. In Southern California, they have, you know, predators for the urchin. Northern California, we don't. We're seeing, you know, some of the kelp come back in Central and Southern California. We're not seeing that in Northern California. So there's different stories and these slight rebounds where people get super excited. That's, you know, kind of goes back to that idea of shifting baselines. You know, a 5% increase, yes, that is movement in the right direction, but that doesn't mean that the kelp has come back. And the media likes to jump on these things as we've seen. So I think this, you know, there was a couple questions in the Q&A from the audience about different regional approaches. I mean, this is what Tristan and others are trying to look at is, you know, what works in this area might not work in that area. What can we learn from Southern California? What can we learn from Tasmania? What can we learn from these other areas? And this is where it's so important that folks are talking to each other.
I've suggested in Chile, there's a campaign underway to create a large marine protected area around the relatively vast kelp forests of Patagonia and southern Chile. And I've strongly suggested that they send some journalists to Fort Bragg to appreciate what they've got and what a worst case scenario looks like. And I think this is a California and a West Coast and a global issue. As Tristan said, the issue is really that we're in a climate emergency, but its impacts are varied from kelp forests to redwood forests to brush fires in Australia and Portugal and Spain. And the challenge is, you know, one, how do we transition quickly enough? And two, the whole eco restoration challenge that we're talking about, and in this case in California. So what is best case scenario? What does the kelp forest of Northern California look like in 10 to 15 years? And how do we get there? You've talked some of it, but give us the best case scenario for restoration. Let's start with you, Tristan.
Yeah, I can start. As soon as you said that, I have a 1.5-year-old son. And when you said that, I was like, best case scenario, him and I are diving together through a kelp forest. But actually, I think that's actually a pretty good outcome. Yeah, I think honestly, in 10, 15 years, I mean, this is like, whew, that's the question, it's like, what can we possibly unlock here? I think ecologically, maybe we'll start with just like the outcome in the field, maybe leave out the details of how we get there at this moment. But honestly, I think it's that we have these connected patches of kelp forests that are being maintained, monitored. And when I say maintained, that means like we have some kind of circular system where our community or our fisher folk or people who engage in that ecosystems are the ones tending it. And that is how we are building our community base, as in like we have infrastructure, people with jobs, like things that center around kelp forest health and making sure those patches do not disappear, right? Like, I think right now we're working on these like 1 acre, these very small scales. It's like, we need to do bigger, better, and just more resilient patches. So personally, I'd love to see like a better network of bigger kelp patches with higher metrics of biodiversity, frankly.
One question that we've seen here is about the genetics and trying to understand why some of these kelp areas are persisting and why some of them are not. And is TNC or other folks using genetics in some of these plant restoration planning efforts?
Yeah, I didn't even get into like a lot of the work that us and others are doing right now, but yes, what we do know is that genetic connectivity is a huge component of all of this, and even unlocking. I just want to take a step back too, that we know so little about bull kelp also relative to other strains of kelp, and especially in the North Coast. But what we do know is that they have seed banking potential, which is just like a cool thing to think about, because even the kelp that we see this year may not be last year's children, right? They could be like children of like, many years ago. In other places of the world, like thousands of years, seed banks have been known to persist, right? So there's a lot of opportunity there to help us understand like which strains, which conditions facilitate that growth. So genetics are kind of a root and foundational understanding of all those other aspects as well. I don't know if that directly answered that question, but genetics are.
Well, what about Grant? Could you see a situation where you have a working fishing port 10 years from now? Because, you go down to Noyo River today, it's pretty quiet.
Yeah, so the 10-year question is probably one of the scariest ones that is asked of myself. And the reason for that is how fast the kelp was lost. Yeah. So we lost 90% in 2 to 3 years, probably faster than that when it all happened. And we've been working on this project, kelp restoration, for 5 years now, to just bring back maybe 10% or 5% boost. So how much can we bring back in 5 to 10 years? It's really scary to think about. I would love to see our harbor continue to be a commercially working waterfront. I don't think it'll ever collapse completely, but it needs to keep going. It really does. Even if it is to branch out and do more fisherman direct type of marketing for all our fisheries. That's fishermen to the public. That's really how things should go. There doesn't need to be a middleman making all this money. But what I really want to see in 10 years is like what Tristan said, there needs to be funding statewide. what you mentioned it earlier, David, and some of the Huffman funding. That's the largest amount of money we've seen put towards restoration yet. And that's going to really kick off a Sonoma County kelp restoration project where there hasn't been any work put into the water yet. So working with the Greater Fairlands Association, who received that money from Huffman, that should get divers in the water this summer, starting a clearing down there. And hopefully that's just the tip of the iceberg for, support and funding to come. Because unfortunately, without a commercial market for this product, the empty urchins coming out and even outplanting and kelp going in, it's all out of pocket resource right now.
Mm.
And Grant, you said when we spoke before, I love that, the sanctuary is now focusing on doing some of this restoration work and working with commercial fishermen. But the unfortunate, sad truth is there's not that many guys left that are on the Sonoma coast and on the Mendocino coast to do this work. Like we need commercial fishermen to help in this effort, but they've either retired or moved on to other things. So that the fishing communities that we did have on the coast have really shifted quite a bit in the last decade.
Yes, exactly. The Bodega Bay urchin industry was greatly affected by the enactment of the MLPA process. The MPAs outside of Bodega Bay took over half of the urchin harvest zone that those divers depended on. So a lot of the divers in Bodega Bay were out of this, were out of the picture before the kelp loss happened. There are still a couple divers down in the area trying to make a living, but it's very tough. And then, like you said, Natasha, the average age of the urchin diver is about 50 or 60. I mean, they've been doing this, like Jeff said, he's been diving for 30 years. My dad's been diving for close to 40 years. They've done so well and they've had such great experiences to now get close to retirement dealing with hardship like this. A lot of them just want out of the picture now. They don't want to ruin this great experience they had with what's happening now. So our industry of maybe 50 or more active guys is at like 16 now. And some of those haven't even been diving, but they're just holding on to it to get back in the water. If any of you on this call have dove, you understand why. Being underwater, it's amazing. It's not like anything you'll experience. And when you can focus your whole livelihood on a career where it's spent underwater, it's an amazing experience. The things I've seen, it's undescribable. I mean, all the way back to these last two discoveries. This last sunflower star I found, I was diving all day. I made all these survey jumps just looking for good urchins, and I couldn't find any good urchins. And I'm just looking at spot after spot after spot where there's no urchins worth picking because the quality is so poor. And then I'm able to find the sunflower star. It was like the clouds, not to be picturesque, but it was like the clouds parted and the sun came down, and it's like there might be some hope with this fishery that I've put all my effort into. My whole career so far of my working life has been put into being an urchin diver. I'd hate to not get my 30 or 40 years out of it like all these other guys.
That might be a great place to stop on that note.
I think it's about communicating to the larger world also. So tell us when, in the midst of this crisis, when Sequoias of the Sea is going to be out.
Well, we're planning on filming throughout the spring and summer and editing through the fall and get this film out at the beginning of next year to tell the story. And I'd love for Tristan and Grant, and I can kind of kick it off, just like how people can get involved and what folks can do. I think most of the people on this call are kind of ocean environmental folks, but what we're really trying to do with the film is reach a larger audience to tell the story. And how can someone, in Middle America who's watching the film or learning about this topic that is not a diver, is not getting in the water, how can they make a difference? How can they their actions impact what's happening locally in Fort Bragg.
Okay, Natasha, you first.
Well, as we've talked about, this is a climate change story. So we go back to, reducing fossil fuel consumption, changing your behaviors, whether it's from what you buy to the seafood you eat and asking where it comes from. I think locally here in California, we're very fortunate and we can have access to some amazing local seafood. But this is a tough, this is something that I've been grappling with, like how do we engage that larger audience? If you're not a water person and you're not spending time in the water. One of the things obviously folks can do is sign up with Reef Check and become a diver and help do surveys, or sign up and get in the water at Tankers Reef or Casper Cove in Mendocino and go smash urchins. This is something that anyone can do. Even if you're not certified as a scuba diver, you can snorkel and try to get a few. But what else? What else can folks do?
Grant, people should buy direct from fishermen, shouldn't they?
They should. They should. It keeps everybody going. I wish I was able to have such a strong influx of the public to my boat when I'm doing dockside sales. I see the pictures and I hear the stories about how many people visit the markets down in Southern California, and I'm envious of that. I love selling urchins off of the boat, and it's the conversation. It's meeting somebody. It's answering their questions face to face. It's that aspect of it. It's not just the monetary gain of selling my product. It's the outreach. And then like I've been told from a lot of people that have seen me sell urchins, Tristan, one of them, it's like a little educational piece, especially right now with the state of the industry we're going in. They always have questions, and unfortunately I just, vomit mouth and I just let it all out. I tell them what's happening. I say, well, it started like this and now we're like this. And the next thing you know, I look up while I'm making an uni shooter and I've got like 10 or 12 people standing there listening that don't even want to try an urchin. They just want to hear what I have to say.
So Royal Harbor, go look for the crazy horse.
Yeah.
And Tristan, what can people generally do? Obviously check out the Nature Conservancy.
Yeah, that's always helpful. If you want to check out what we do more broadly, or this was like the tip of the iceberg. There's like a million things. If there's anything of interest, don't hesitate to get in touch. But I think this is a tough one for me because it's maybe to Natasha's point of like, how do you tell someone from Middle America like about kelp? First off, I think just acknowledging kelp as an ecosystem, I think that's where we're at right now, right? Which is to Grant's point earlier and Jeff's to an extent, it's like unlocking these federal dollars, and to unlock those federal dollars to help support these like really big multi-year and collaborative like restoration projects, they have to fit the build of like a habitat. So right now we're working to make kelp just as valuable as a habitat for the United States as our corals, as our mangroves, as these seagrasses, not to distract from those places that also need it, but bring it back home too. So for like a Middle America situation, I think just acknowledging that like you do value healthy ecosystems and just respecting that the coast of California, kelp is ours, like kelp is huge for us. And so just supporting that movement, I think is big. And then another one that's slightly like disassociated from kelp, but still important, is wherever you live, whatever that ecosystem is that is of utmost value to you or your community, like respect it, spend your time like volunteering for it if you can, or just go walk in it and observe it and respect it, pick up trash in it, like creating that like personal connection to nature is like making people feel something is when they do something. Right. So whatever that means to you, if you want to like love kelp, but like you're too far and oak trees are your thing, like go hang out with the oak trees. It's just a matter of like valuing what you have around you.
Right. And it's like Vicki Nichols Goldstein, my co-host on the Rising Tide Ocean podcast, runs the Inland Ocean Coalition. And it's all about all waters connected and it all flows to the sea. And as you were saying, it's about, that balance of warning and wonder all of us who dive in kelp think it's just one of the most amazing. It is one of the most amazing places. When I was a kid, I thought I was a generation too soon to visit alien worlds. Well, anyone who dives on coral or kelp sees alien worlds, and they're amazing and fragile, and we need to protect them. And it's been thrilling to talk with three major protectors here, with Natasha and you, Grant, and you, Tristan. And thanks to the California Ocean Day, and thanks to being in a state. We talk about growing the solutions faster than the problems. We're 40 million people. We're now the world's 4th largest economy. And we show that you can do well by your coast and ocean. And we have to be a model for the world to turn this disaster around. So thank you all for the time you've given.
Thank you. And this will
thank
be
you.
recorded and available through Environment California for folks that want to share.
Yep, just drop the link in the chat. But again, thanks everyone for joining us. There will be future panel conversations happening, one specifically focused on the coastal resiliency budget, a panel focused on plastic pollution, and another panel focused on additional marine protections across the state. So stay tuned for additional conversations. But again, thank you to our wonderful panelists and our moderator, David, for facilitating such a productive conversation. But I look forward to seeing the Sequoias of the Sea film, and just looking forward to seeing all the great work that's this group continues to put out there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you again for having us. Bye.